Cyrus was 72, a retired school principal from a small coastal town. For most of his life, he had been the strong, dependable figure everyone looked to for guidance. But a few months ago, something changed. One evening, while walking back from the market, Cyrus felt a sudden wave of dizziness. His vision blurred for a moment, and his steps faltered. By the time he reached home, his heart was racing and he felt an odd tightness in his chest. His wife insisted he see the doctor immediately, and the next day, they found themselves sitting in a small, sunlit clinic room, waiting for the news. The doctor's face was kind but serious. He explained that Cyrus's blood pressure was too high. His blood sugar was creeping into dangerous territory, and his cholesterol wasn't where it should be. "You've always been careful," the doctor said, "but your body is telling us it needs a little extra help now." The words hung in the air like a quiet alarm. Cyrus had always believed that his modest diet and occasional walks were enough, but now he felt an undeniable truth pressing in. It was time to make real changes or risk losing the vitality he still wanted to enjoy. That night, Cyrus sat at his kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed. The moonlight streamed through the window, catching the edges of a small bowl of green pods his wife had bought earlier that day. Okra, he remembered seeing it often at the market but rarely brought it home. "Too slimy," he used to say. Yet now, as he turned one of the pods in his hand, he remembered something his grandmother once told him. The foods we ignore are often the ones we need most. He didn't know it yet, but those humble green pods would mark the beginning of a quiet transformation in his life. The next morning, his wife cooked the okra simply, adding a touch of olive oil, a sprinkle of salt, and a squeeze of lemon. To his surprise, it wasn't slimy at all, tender, slightly sweet, and full of a freshness he hadn't tasted in years. Over the weeks that followed, okra began appearing more often in their meals. Sometimes roasted with garlic, sometimes simmered in a light soup, sometimes tossed in with his morning eggs. He didn't think much of it at first, but gradually something began to shift. His digestion felt lighter, his energy steadier, and even the heaviness in his legs after long walks seemed to ease. When he returned to the clinic for his next checkup, the doctor raised his eyebrows in pleasant surprise. His blood pressure had dropped into a healthier range, his cholesterol numbers improved, and his blood sugar had steadied. "You're on the right track, Cyrus," the doctor said, smiling. "Keep doing whatever you're doing." Cyrus chuckled quietly to himself. It was nothing extraordinary, just a simple green fruit he had once dismissed without a second thought. And that's where our story begins. Today, I want to take you into Cyrus's journey, not just to tell you what happened, but to show you the 10 powerful, science-backed ways this humble food can change your health. You might just find that the answer to your own well-being has been waiting in the market all along, quietly, patiently, ready to help you take the next step toward a stronger, healthier life. The day after his checkup, Cyrus woke earlier than usual. The sea breeze drifted in through the half-open window, carrying the scent of salt and the faint cry of seagulls. His wife, Lena, was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. On the table sat a small basket of fresh okra she had bought from the farmer's market the evening before. The pods were still cool from the night air, their skin firm and green. Cyrus looked at them for a moment, remembering the doctor's gentle but serious words, "Your body is asking for help." He wasn't the sort of man to make dramatic changes overnight, but that morning, something inside him felt different. Maybe it was the memory of his grandmother's old saying about forgotten foods, or maybe it was the quiet fear that had crept into him after hearing about his rising blood pressure. Whatever it was, he picked up a pod, turned it in his hand, and said, "Let's try it." Lena smiled knowingly, as if she had been waiting for that moment. She cooked the okra simply, whole pods, tossed in a bit of olive oil, a pinch of sea salt, and roasted until their edges began to blister. There was no slime, no heaviness, just a light, almost nutty aroma filling the kitchen. Cyrus took his first bite cautiously, expecting to force himself through it. But to his surprise, the flavor was gentle, almost sweet, and it paired perfectly with the fried egg on his plate. It wasn't just the taste that surprised him, it was the way it felt to eat something so unassuming, yet so alive with freshness. Over the next few days, he noticed small but curious changes. His breakfast left him satisfied but not sluggish. That mid-morning heaviness, the kind that made him reach for another cup of coffee, didn't seem to come anymore. His stomach felt lighter somehow. He didn't mention it at first, thinking it might just be coincidence, but deep down, he wondered if these little green pods were quietly doing something good inside him. By the end of the first week, his morning walks by the sea felt easier. He didn't have to pause as often to catch his breath, and his steps seemed steadier. Lena teased him, saying, "Maybe it's the ocean air." But Cyrus knew the ocean air had always been there. Something else was changing, something from within. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky fade into a soft orange, Lena asked him if he'd like her to make okra again tomorrow. Without hesitation, he nodded. "Yes," he said simply, "I think I could get used to this." What he didn't say was that it wasn't just the taste he was getting used to, it was the feeling of possibility, of small steps toward better health. And somewhere inside, he knew this was only the beginning. 2 weeks had passed since Cyrus first decided to give okra a place at his breakfast table. He didn't announce it to anyone, not even his closest friends from the old principal's club who still met twice a month for coffee. But inside, he could feel something shifting. One breezy afternoon, as he walked home from the market carrying a small bag of fresh fish and another bundle of okra, he realized something strange. The familiar thump in his chest when climbing the last hill to his house wasn't there. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but to Cyrus, it felt like the difference between walking with a weight on his back and walking free. He remembered how, just a month ago, his heart would pound heavily after even a short walk. The doctor had warned him about high blood pressure, and those words had settled into his mind like a heavy stone. But now, with each steady heartbeat, that stone felt just a little lighter. That evening, Lena made okra in a tomato stew, letting the pods simmer until they soaked up the tangy, sweet flavor. Cyrus dipped a piece of warm bread into the sauce, savoring it slowly. It wasn't just food anymore, it felt like medicine his body welcomed, even craved. Lena noticed the way he lingered over each bite and asked, "Better than last week's roast?" He smiled. "Different, but just as good. My heart feels calmer lately." He wasn't imagining it. Though he didn't yet know the full science behind it, okra was quietly helping his heart. Its fiber was working to ease the strain, sweeping away what his doctor had once called unwanted baggage in his blood. The potassium was helping his blood vessels relax, guiding his pressure towards safer shores. Cyrus didn't think of these things in numbers or charts. He felt them in the quiet rhythm of his walks, in the way his body no longer protested each climb. One afternoon, his daughter May stopped by with her 2 little boys. The children ran straight into the kitchen, demanding Lena's fried fish, while May settled on the porch with her father. "Dad," she said softly, "you look different, more rested." Cyrus chuckled. "Maybe I am. Your mother's been feeding me like a king." He didn't mention okra by name, but Lena, overhearing from the kitchen, gave him a knowing look. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Cyrus sat at the table and thought about how easy it would have been to dismiss this change as nothing, to believe that, at his age, things could only get worse, not better. But here he was, 2 weeks into a small, almost accidental change, and he could feel his body whispering its thanks. In that moment, he decided it wasn't just about trying okra anymore. It was about listening to the quiet messages his body had been sending for years. And maybe, just maybe, it was about giving it what it needed before the doctor had to say the words again. "We're running out of time." By the 3rd week, Cyrus began to notice a different kind of change, one that crept in quietly and only revealed itself in the small rhythms of his day. He had always kept a jar of hard candies on the kitchen counter, a little habit from his years at the school when students or fellow teachers would drop by his office. Even in retirement, the jar stayed there, though now it was mostly for him. On slow afternoons, when a wave of fatigue would settle over him, he'd unwrap one without thinking, letting the sweetness push him through until dinner. But lately, that mid-afternoon crash wasn't showing up as often. He'd finish his lunch, sometimes a light fish stew, sometimes a simple sandwich with a few roasted okra pods on the side, and carry on with his day without feeling the heavy pull of sleepiness. He didn't even think about the candy jar. The first time it struck him was when he went to offer a piece to his grandson during a visit, and realized he hadn't touched it all week. One Saturday, while Lena was trimming okra at the kitchen counter, Cyrus leaned against the doorway and said, "I don't get that shaky feeling anymore, the one I get if I wait too long to eat." Lena turned, knife in hand, and raised an eyebrow. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" He nodded slowly. "Feels steadier, like my energy isn't jumping up and down all the time." It wasn't magic, though it felt that way. Okra, with its gentle but powerful fiber, was quietly working to keep his blood sugar from spiking and dipping like a restless tide. It was slowing the rush of sugar into his bloodstream after meals, helping his body find a calmer, more even rhythm. Cyrus didn't think about it in those terms. All he knew was that his mornings felt lighter, his afternoons more productive, and his evenings free from that dull, exhausted fog. The change didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, as they sat by the window shelling peas for dinner, Lena glanced at him and said, "You've been walking faster lately. Even the neighbors noticed." Cyrus chuckled. "Maybe I am. I feel like I can keep going without that urge to stop and sit every few steps." At his next check-in with the doctor, the conversation was short but telling. The doctor scanned his latest numbers, nodded, and said, "Your sugar levels look better, more stable." Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked, "What have you been doing differently?" Cyrus hesitated, a small smile forming. "Eating a little more green," he said vaguely. The doctor laughed. "Whatever green it is, keep at it." That night, over dinner, Cyrus told Lena about the appointment. They both knew it was more than just a little more green. It was a choice, one small, consistent choice, repeated day after day until it began to shape not just his meals, but the way he moved through life. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the last of the evening light touched the garden, Cyrus thought about the candy jar again. It still sat there on the counter, untouched, and for the first time, he realized he didn't miss it at all. A month into his quiet experiment with okra, Cyrus noticed something he hadn't felt in years. The heaviness in his legs was beginning to lift. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The ache that used to greet him halfway up the market hill was fainter now, and he could stand at the pier for longer without shifting his weight or leaning against the railing. He thought about it one breezy afternoon while watching the fishing boats return, their nets heavy with the day's catch. His own body, he realized, felt a little less heavy too. Lena was the first to point it out. "You carried those grocery bags up the stairs without stopping," she said with a faint smile, recalling how he used to hand her the lighter ones halfway up. Cyrus shrugged, pretending it was nothing, but inside he felt a quiet pride. It was around this time that the doctor's earlier warning about low iron drifted back into his mind. Last year, a blood test had shown his iron levels skimming the lower edge of normal. The doctor had told him to keep an eye on it, to eat more iron-rich foods. At the time, Cyrus nodded politely, but he never made much of an effort beyond the occasional piece of red meat. Now, without even realizing it, he'd been giving his body exactly what it had been asking for. Okra wasn't just a gentle helper for his heart and sugar, it was quietly nourishing his blood. Its natural iron content, paired with vitamin C that helped him absorb it better, was working in his favor. Cyrus didn't have the science terms for it. All he knew was that the tiredness that used to cling to him after sweeping the porch or watering the garden seemed to be losing its grip. One afternoon, his grandson asked if he could come along to the market. They walked together, the boy skipping ahead, Cyrus keeping a steady pace. On the way back, bags in hand, his grandson suddenly looked up and said, "Grandpa, you're fast now." Cyrus laughed, but inside, the comment sank in deep. He wasn't trying to be fast. His body simply moved more easily. That evening, Lena prepared okra with a bit of garlic and lemon, roasting it until the edges curled. The smell filled the kitchen, and as they ate, Cyrus thought about how strange it was that such a small, simple food could make such a difference. He didn't feel like a man chasing health anymore. He felt like a man quietly reclaiming it. Later that night, sitting on the porch under the wide, dark sky, Cyrus realized he hadn't once thought about slowing down today. The day had unfolded naturally, without fatigue telling him when to stop. That, more than any number on a chart, felt like progress. And deep inside, he knew that if he kept listening to his body and kept that humble green fruit close, the strength would only keep returning. It was a crisp morning when Cyrus decided to take the long route to the market, the one that wound along the waterfront before looping back through the main square. He hadn't done it in years. The cobblestones near the old dock were uneven, and he'd always been wary of catching his foot or stumbling. But that morning, with the sea air filling his lungs and the gulls calling overhead, he felt steady. Not cautious, steady. The truth was, he hadn't noticed the change all at once. It crept up on him slowly, like the tide rising along the pier. A month ago, stepping down from the porch would make his knees feel stiff, his ankles reluctant to bend. But now, his movements felt smoother, his joints looser. He could walk farther without pausing, and when Lena called from the kitchen to bring her something from the cellar, he no longer hesitated at the thought of the steep steps. One afternoon, May dropped by with her boys. She noticed him bending down easily to pick up a toy car from the floor. "Careful, Dad," she said out of habit. He straightened, smiling. "I'm fine," he replied, and he meant it. There was a lightness in his step, a surety in his movements that hadn't been there before. Cyrus didn't know much about the nutrients hidden in his daily meals, but without realizing it, he'd been feeding his bones exactly what they needed. The calcium in the okra was building quietly, layer by layer, like steady work on a strong foundation. And the vitamin K, something he'd never heard of until Lena read it out loud from an article, was helping keep that strength locked in place. Evenings became his favorite time to notice the difference. After dinner, he and Lena would stroll down the narrow street to watch the sun dip into the horizon. Before, he would keep one hand near the wall or railing, just in case. Now he walked beside her freely, hands swinging at his sides, confident in each step. One day at the market, an old friend spotted him and said, "You look younger these days. What's your secret?" Cyrus laughed, shaking his head. "No secret," he said. But when he got home, he thought about the question. It wasn't a secret. It was something small, something ordinary, something he'd once dismissed without a thought. Later that night, as he climbed the stairs to bed, Cyrus realized how far he'd come. Each step felt firm, unshaken by the doubts that used to shadow his movements. Walking wasn't just walking anymore. It was a quiet declaration that he was still steady, still strong, and still moving forward. It was a late afternoon when Cyrus sat by the window, reading the newspaper. The soft light of the setting sun spilled across the page, and he caught himself noticing something he hadn't in a long while. The words were clear. Not perfect, but clearer than they'd been in months. Usually, around this time of day, his eyes would grow tired, the print blurring at the edges. He'd rub his temples, blaming the long hours or the dim light. But today, he simply kept reading. The change was subtle, but undeniable. A few days earlier, while mending a loose button on his shirt, he realized he could thread the needle without fumbling for the reading glasses he normally wore. Lena noticed it too. One evening, she held up a jar from across the kitchen and asked, "Can you read this label for me?" He read it without hesitation. She smiled. "Looks like someone's eyes are waking up again." Cyrus hadn't connected it at first, but the thought nagged at him. His doctor had once explained that foods rich in certain pigments could help protect the eyes. Something about shielding them from light damage, keeping the vision sharp for longer. And now, thinking back to all those meals where okra appeared, roasted, stewed, or simply tossed into a pan with olive oil, he realized he'd been feeding his eyes without even knowing it. There was a quiet satisfaction in this discovery. He'd lived long enough to see friends his age begin to struggle more and more with their sight, giving up evening reading, avoiding night driving, and missing the details of the world around them. But here he was, sitting by the window, catching the fine ripples on the bay, seeing the thin, white lines of the gulls' wings as they crossed the golden horizon. One weekend, May invited him to watch her boys play soccer. The field was alive with movement, children in bright jerseys chasing the ball, the quick arc of a pass, the sudden sprint toward the goal. Cyrus could follow it all without straining. He could see the grin on his grandson's face when he scored, the slight scuff on the ball as it rolled into the net. These were details he might have missed before, lost in the blur. That night, over dinner, he told Lena, "It's funny, I feel like the world's gotten sharper lately." She glanced at him knowingly. "Or maybe you've started seeing what's been there all along." They shared a quiet smile. For Cyrus, it wasn't about defying age. He knew the years would still leave their marks. But it was about holding on to the small joys that made life vivid. The way Lena's eyes caught the light when she laughed, the way the market stalls glowed in the early morning sun, the faces of his grandchildren when they came running up the path. And if something as simple as those green pods could help keep those joys in focus, he knew he'd keep them close for as long as he could. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and Cyrus had just finished lunch, a simple plate of grilled fish, steamed vegetables, and a small side of okra sautéed with a pinch of garlic. He leaned back in his chair, waiting for the familiar heaviness to creep in, the one that usually made him reach for a cup of strong tea and a seat on the porch. But it didn't come. Instead, there was only a comfortable fullness, like his body had taken in exactly what it needed. No more, no less. This was new. For years, big meals had left him feeling as though a stone sat in his stomach. weighing him down and slowing his steps. He'd learned to expect it, even plan around it, knowing he'd need a stretch of stillness before he could get on with the rest of his day. But now, with okra quietly finding its way into more and more of his meals, that heaviness was slipping away. Lena noticed the difference first. "You're moving around after lunch these days," she said one afternoon as she found him sweeping the back porch just minutes after finishing his meal. "No more sinking into that armchair like you used to." Cyrus grinned. "Feels better this way. I don't feel like I'm dragging a full sack around inside me." What neither of them said out loud was that okra had been helping him in a way he hadn't expected, keeping his digestion smooth and easy. It wasn't something he thought much about when he was younger, but now, in his 70s, it mattered more than ever. The fiber in the okra was quietly doing its work, keeping everything moving as it should. No strain, no discomfort, just a quiet rhythm that made his days flow better. He thought about it again a few days later while visiting the market. Standing in line at his favorite vegetable stall, he overheard two women talking about how they avoided okra because of that slimy mess. Cyrus almost smiled to himself. If only they knew. If only they could feel the way his afternoons now felt. Lighter, easier, free of the sluggishness that used to drag at him. That evening, as he stood at the kitchen counter trimming the ends off a fresh batch of okra, he thought about how small changes had brought him here. No dramatic diet overhaul, no complicated plan, just adding one simple thing to his meals, letting it quietly reshape the way his body worked. And maybe that was the secret. It wasn't about chasing health in leaps and bounds, it was about giving the body what it needed in gentle, steady steps. For Cyrus, each forkful of okra was another step toward comfort, toward ease, toward the kind of days where he could finish a meal and still have the energy to greet whatever came next. It was a Tuesday morning when Cyrus sat at the kitchen table, reading a letter from an old friend who had moved away years ago. The words stirred up a memory of a summer they'd spent fishing at the lake. He could recall the exact curve of the shoreline, the rough wooden dock under their feet, even the sound of their laughter echoing across the water. It surprised him, not the memory itself, but how sharp and whole it felt, as if he'd only been there yesterday. In recent years, memories sometimes came to him like fogged glass, there but not quite in focus. Names slipped away, dates blurred together, and small details seemed to vanish into the mist. But lately, something felt different. His thoughts were flowing more easily, conversation stayed clear in his mind, and he found himself recalling small things without having to stop and search for them. Lena noticed it too. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch discussing plans for the weekend, she said, "You're remembering things so quickly these days, even the little details." Cyrus laughed softly. "Maybe my brain's waking up again," he said. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just chance. Something had been shifting. He thought back to a moment at the market 2 weeks earlier. A neighbor had stopped him to ask about a poem he used to recite at school assemblies. Without hesitation, he began to recite it, line for line, as if the words had been waiting just beneath the surface. The neighbor clapped in delight, but Cyrus walked away with a quiet sense of wonder. He hadn't thought about that poem in years. There was no sudden revelation, no dramatic turning point, but over time, Cyrus began to connect the dots. The doctor had once told him that the brain needed good fuel just like the rest of the body, nutrients that helped protect it from the wear and tear of age. And here he was, eating okra almost daily, feeding himself without realizing that he was also feeding his mind. The antioxidants and vitamins inside those green pods weren't just tending to his heart or his blood, they were guarding his thoughts too. One evening, May brought over an old family album. They flipped through page after page, and Cyrus found himself recalling not just the people in the photos, but the little stories behind each moment. "That was the summer your mother insisted we camp by the river," he told May. "It rained the entire week, but you wouldn't stop playing in the mud." They both laughed until their eyes watered, and Cyrus felt a warmth deep inside, not just from the laughter, but from the joy of remembering so vividly. As the evening wore on and the album closed, Cyrus realized how precious it was to hold on to these pieces of life. Faces, voices, small moments. They were the threads that wove his story. And if something as humble as okra could help keep those threads from fraying, then it was worth far more than its place on the plate. That night, as he turned off the kitchen light, he caught sight of the small basket of fresh okra waiting for tomorrow's meal. He smiled to himself, grateful for the way something so ordinary had become such a quiet ally. not just for his body, but for the part of him that held his life's memories. It was a warm Thursday morning when Cyrus stood in front of his wardrobe, trying on an old linen shirt he hadn't worn in years. He buttoned it all the way and paused. The fabric didn't pull at his stomach the way it used to. He stepped back, studying himself in the mirror. The change was subtle, no dramatic transformation, no sudden drop in size. But it was there. He moved his arms, feeling the ease in his shoulders, the way the shirt hung more naturally. Lena noticed it right away when she came into the room. "That shirt hasn't seen daylight in ages," she said, smiling. "It looks comfortable on you again." Cyrus chuckled softly. "Feels comfortable too." He didn't think much about weight these days. The years had taught him to care more about how he felt than what the numbers said. But lately he couldn't deny it. His body felt lighter. His steps were quicker, his movements easier. It wasn't from skipping meals or counting calories. In fact, he still enjoyed hearty dinners and the occasional slice of pie at the cafe. But over the past months, something had shifted in the quiet rhythm of his eating. Okra had become a steady companion on his plate, roasted, stewed, sometimes slipped into a simple stir-fry. The fiber in it, though invisible, was quietly keeping him full longer, slowing his hunger in a way that made snacking less tempting. He realized it one afternoon when May brought the boys over after school. She set a plate of pastries on the table, and while the children devoured theirs in minutes, Cyrus found he wasn't all that interested. He took one small bite and left it at that, surprised at his own lack of craving. It wasn't willpower, it was simply that he didn't feel the need. That same week, he walked to the market using the longer route through the park. It was a gentle uphill climb, the kind that used to leave him stopping once or twice to catch his breath. But now he reached the top without pausing, his legs carrying him steadily forward. There was no sense of heaviness dragging at him, no dull ache in his knees as he stepped onto the level path again. One evening, as he and Lena sat down to dinner, he mentioned it. "You know, I think I've been carrying myself differently these days." She looked up from her plate, curious. "How so?" He thought for a moment. "Feels like I've put down a weight I didn't even know I was carrying." It wasn't just about the physical ease. With each lighter step, Cyrus felt a little more open to the world again, more willing to say yes when the boys asked him to join a game of catch, more eager to take Lena's hand for a walk after supper. It was as though the small shifts in his body were making space for bigger shifts in his life. And through it all, he kept coming back to the same quiet truth. No crash diets, no rigid plans, no grand declarations. Just one humble food given a place at his table, slowly working its way into the fabric of his days, and, without fanfare, helping him feel like himself again. The rainy season had rolled in, bringing with it the kind of damp chill that settled deep into the bones. In years past, this was when Cyrus often caught a lingering cough or felt an ache in his joints that took weeks to fade. But this year felt different. As the rain pattered against the windows and mist curled through the streets, Cyrus found himself feeling steady. No stubborn sniffles, no nagging chest tightness, no stiffness that kept him from his morning walks. One afternoon, May stopped by with a basket of bread still warm from the bakery. She hung her umbrella by the door and eyed her father curiously. "You seem stronger this winter," she said. "Usually by now you're bundled up like a quilt and avoiding the market." Cyrus smiled faintly. "Haven't felt the need," he replied, glancing toward the kitchen where Lena was trimming a fresh batch of okra for dinner. He didn't fully understand the science of it, but he knew how he felt. The slow, steady changes since okra became part of his daily meals seemed to go beyond his heart, his weight, or even his energy. It was as if his whole system had found a calmer, more resilient rhythm. He woke without the lingering soreness in his joints, his hands no longer stiff in the morning. Even on days when the weather turned raw and damp, his body seemed less inclined to protest. The doctor had once told him that much of staying healthy was about fighting the little battles before they became big ones, keeping inflammation low, giving the body what it needed to repair itself quietly each day. Without realizing it, Cyrus had been doing exactly that. Okra's gentle, anti-inflammatory nature, its vitamins and minerals, had been fortifying him meal by meal, season by season. One evening, while sipping tea after dinner, Lena said, "You know, I think we've both been faring better this year. Fewer colds, fewer aches." Cyrus nodded slowly. "Maybe we've finally learned how to eat for the years we have now," she smiled. "Or maybe the years have finally taught us what to eat." Later that week, Cyrus ventured to the market on a misty morning, The stone streets glistened under the light rain, and the air carried the earthy scent of fresh vegetables. He stopped at his favorite stall, where the vendor was arranging baskets of okra, their green pods beaded with droplets. Cyrus picked up a handful, weighing them in his palm. He thought of all the small, invisible ways they had been guarding his health, a quiet armor that asked for nothing but a place on his plate. As he walked home, the wind picked up, tugging at his coat. He pulled it closer, not because he felt fragile, but because he simply wanted to keep the warmth in. His steps were steady, his breath even, his mind clear. He knew the years ahead would still have their challenges, but he also knew he wasn't meeting them empty-handed. He had found something, humble, green, unassuming, that stood by him every day, guarding his health one meal at a time. Looking back, Cyrus could hardly believe how far he'd come from that first morning when he agreed to give okra a chance. It started as nothing more than a quiet experiment, but over time it became a turning point. His heart beat steadier, his steps grew lighter, and the weight of fatigue that once shadowed his days slowly lifted. Even his vision felt clearer, his mind sharper, gifts he hadn't expected from something so humble. It wasn't a miracle or a magic trick, it was the power of one small change, repeated day after day, shaping his health in ways no single pill or quick fix ever could. Cyrus had learned that sometimes the answers we're searching for aren't hidden in complicated plans. They're sitting in plain sight, waiting for us to notice. For him, okra wasn't just food. It was a reminder that caring for your health doesn't have to be overwhelming. It can be as simple as making space on your plate for something that loves you back. And so, as he walks through his days now, up the market hill without stopping, reading the fine print without squinting, joining his grandchildren in games without hesitation, he carries with him not just better health, but a renewed belief in what's possible. If Cyrus could speak to anyone standing where he once stood, unsure if change was still within reach, he would say this: start small, but start now. Let one choice lead to another, and trust the quiet work your body can do when you give it the right tools. Because sometimes the smallest steps carry us the farthest, and the road ahead can be brighter than you ever imagined.